here. And so this next panel is called, this is here. One second. It's called is Recognition, Rights and Sovereignty. And we have 3 papers in this section too. And so the first one will, presentation will be by Ian Bellows from Cornell University, and his paper is titled Tourism Futures and Afterlives on Nepal's Tamang Heritage Trail. The next paper will be by Aqsa Mengal from Yale University, and that's Sardar or Sarkar, the Climate Justice Implications of Balochistan's Sovereignty Movement. And the last one is going to be by Mangalika Silva from NYU, and that's Banjaxed Sovereignty, Reimagining the Needful Non-Sovereign Democratization. So we'll start with Ian, and so I have these flashcards or whatever you call them now. So 5 minutes, 2 minutes, or 1 minute, or depending on how they are needed. So thank you. So I'll maybe sit here in the front over here.
Okay, we good? Okay. Hello everyone, I'm Ian Bellows. I'm a master's student in Asian Studies at Cornell University. Today I'll be presenting on tourism futures and afterlives on Nepal's Tamang Heritage Trail. This presentation examines the effects of ethnic heritage tourism in 2 indigenous mountain communities, Bridham and Gatlang. My research is an attempt to move beyond a rubric of positive or negative tourism impacts. Instead, I focus on how tourism increases people's assets and capabilities, and how some people build on this foundation to work toward their imagined futures. These findings are part of a broader mixed methods project on social ecological change and adaptation. It's very much a work in progress, it's still evolving, so I welcome any feedback and suggestions. So I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking the people of Bridham, Gatlang, and other communities in Upper Rostova, whose perspectives and lived experiences I share today, and without whom this research would not have been possible. I'd also like to express my gratitude to my research team in Nepal, Gilraj Rai, Susma Mata, and Nima Pampartama. So Rostova district is a mountainous region about 125 kilometers northwest of Nepal's capital Kathmandu. On the north, it's bordered by China's Tibet Autonomous Region. As a borderland between South Asia and the Tibetan Plateau, Rostova has been an important corridor for trans-Himalayan trade, warfare, pilgrimage, and cultural exchange for centuries. Historically, Rostova has been defined by its subordinate relationship to the state and its incorporation in a broader political economic system. Rostova is one of the first areas to be forcibly annexed into what would become the modern state of Nepal. Tamang and Tibetan indigenous minorities face discrimination and are subjected to extractive policies, especially coercion and compulsory labor. These are critical to developing the central state, but dismantled the indigenous economy and left the region deeply impoverished and underdeveloped. In 1976, Nepal established Langtang National Park, which functions as a further locus of state control over indigenous populations and resources in the name of promoting conservation and tourism. More recently, the pace of change has increased dramatically. At a geopolitical moment of increasing Nepal-China connectivity, transboundary infrastructure development is booming, including the completion of a trans-Himalayan highway, a new border crossing, and numerous hydropower projects. Increasing outmigration for education and employment is eroding the viability of rural communities. Climate change threatens the ecological foundation of traditional Himalayan livelihoods. Amidst this shifting political economy of rural livelihoods, previous templates for how to make a living are increasingly in question, while new ones remain unsettled. As an agent of development and community transformation, tourism offers one potential avenue for local people who engage with challenges and opportunities and pursue their own future-making projects. So these historical legacies and contemporary trends shape daily life in Bridham and Gatlang. Bridham is an ethnically Tibetan village of about 150 people, centered around homestay tourism, while Gatlang is an ethnically Tamang village of about 2,300 people with a more diversified rural economy. Tourism came to Gatlang and Bridham between 2003 and 2006, when the Tourism for Rural Poverty Alleviation Program established the Tamang Heritage Trail trekking circuit. As the name suggests, the goal of the project was to reduce poverty and promote socioeconomic development through ethnic heritage tourism. The TRPAP followed a community-based pro-poor tourism model and built capacity through social mobilization, training, microloans, and construction of community infrastructure like trails and suspension bridges, drinking water and sanitation facilities, and waste management systems. It also worked to market and promote the new circuit, which commoditized indigenous culture and lifeways as its primary tourism attraction. The new circuit was initially successful. It created employment opportunities for local people, especially running tourism businesses like homestays and guest houses. Eventually, dozens of regional households became involved in tourism. It also gained popularity as a tourism product, and by its peak in 2012, as many as 67,000 tourists visited the THT area each year. Unfortunately for households and communities invested in tourism, this situation didn't last. Tourism soon declined as the novelty of the THT dissipated and trekkers gravitated toward new destinations. The 2015 earthquakes damaged tourism businesses and attractions, and extended border closures and lockdowns during the pandemic caused tourism to collapse. Today, the THT area attracts a few hundred tourists per year, making tourism's continued economic viability highly uncertain. The TRPAP's emphasis on holistic development means that tourism has already left a substantial legacy. Tourism generates new resources, capabilities, and connections. In turn, this enables new forms of agency and meaning-making, which articulate diverse and often contradictory aspirations for what people want their community to be like. Tourism positions people as agents rather than as targets of development, but this prompts the question, what imagined features does tourism enable, and for whom? Households in both villages reported that tourism helped increase household well-being and community development. Despite the stresses and shocks of the past decade, almost all participating households reported their level of education, housing, utilities, health, assets, income, and overall security stayed the same or increased. In most cases, tourism was the main reason for improvement. At the community level, tourism helped increase physical infrastructure, build local markets, conserve culture and the environment. Many people also said it added to their way of life without taking anything important away. People in Britain, where 22 out of 38 households are involved in tourism, perceived it to be much more impactful because of the village's smaller size and lower starting level of development. Most of these benefits are non-monetary and extend far beyond tourism itself. In Britain, for example, skills to pursue new livelihood activities, extra local social networks, and educational sponsorships create new socioeconomic and spatial mobilities. Half of all villagers now study or work outside the village, and young people have started migrating to Europe and North America. Even as tourism improves local quality of life, it increasingly creates new life possibilities in the China border area, in Kathmandu, and outside Nepal. This process displaces people from their social, cultural, and ecological context and has potentially drastic implications for community sustainability. In Gatlong, the centerpiece of the Tamang Heritage Trail, tourism has helped remake the Tamang, previously one of the most marginalized indigenous minorities in Nepal, into a celebrated people. Ethnic heritage tourism has strengthened the sense of indigenous identity and cultural distinctiveness. This project also localizes a growing indigenous consciousness that reemerged in Nepal after the Adivasi Janajati, or indigenous nationalities movement in the 1990s. Even as Gatlong became a superlative example of Tamang culture, many aspects of traditional culture and lifeways are fading due to globalization, material development, and sociocultural changes. The destruction of many of the village's traditional houses in the earthquake, growing use of Nepali and English, an influx of non-Tamang Dalit migrants, and Christianization have all had destabilizing effects. The fact that the community is increasingly non-Tamang and non-Buddhist is at odds with imaginaries of Gatlong as a homogeneous, typical Tamang village. For a coalition of community leaders, tourism entrepreneurs, and Buddhist lamas, tourism has become both a rationale and a tool for preserving desirable aspects of local culture and a way to strike back against what they consider to be unwanted sociocultural transitions. For example, some community leaders have partnered with an INGO to build traditional houses for poor families. Others seek to revitalize local Buddhism by constructing new village, temple, Gumba, and other religious buildings. So far, these efforts seem to be working and have found particular resonance with the Nepali domestic tourism market. Growing numbers of young people from Kathmandu now come to experience life in a rural, authentic indigenous community. However, efforts to preserve the past as the basis for future tourism development resonate little with villagers who are not involved in tourism. To them, tourism is just another development intervention that came from outside the community. It was just another project where control is handed over to established elites, even as it was presented as a vehicle of empowerment for marginalized community members. Few people perceive tourism as something they can benefit from or they can mobilize to advance their own aspirations, especially when those driving development are the ones that construct for themselves large guest houses, lodges, concrete buildings, and who now direct development from afar in Kathmandu or even abroad. These changes also obscure the internal diversity of a community that is increasingly multi-ethnic and multi-religious. In Britain, tourism advanced a different set of future-making projects. The TRPAP developed Britain as a homestay community because it lacked mountain views or other attractions, and presented homestays as a broad-based, participatory form of tourism accessible to the average household. Homestays became a source of community pride and collective identity because it put the village on the tourism map and made it a unique destination on the THT. Community management and proportional allocation of guests through a rotation system reinforced the idea that tourism was a resource that benefited everyone in the village. While reality did not always match this aspiration, homestays embodied important existing cultural values of simple living, reciprocity, equity, and community-mindedness. After the TRPAP left, entrepreneurs who saw tourism as a business opportunity opened the first guest houses in the village. This created conflict, which has become worse as homestays increasingly struggle to compete and in some cases attract tourists at all. For their part, guest house owners see homestays not as an end goal, but a stepping stone toward continued evolution of the local tourism economy and the village itself. By expanding the village's tourism carrying capacity, they argue, guest houses can facilitate material development, create jobs, and increase non-monetary tourism benefits. These contrasting attitudes toward tourism articulate different visions for village development and how local people can benefit from tourism. It also speaks to the tension between maintaining the village in a certain condition to sustain a specific kind of tourism or allowing the village to evolve. This conflict raises questions about what tourism is ultimately supposed to accomplish when development interventions leave and who decides. So in summary, tourism transformed life in Britain and Gatlang and created new opportunities under conditions of uncertainty and change. It improved local quality of life by creating new opportunities or by creating new resources and capabilities for participating households, and contributed to many desirable aspects of community socioeconomic development. It created new avenues for historically marginalized indigenous minorities to assert their identity and advocate for recognition and development. But not everyone benefits equally from tourism, and newfound agency is not equally distributed. Case studies from Britain and Gatlang briefly illustrate how some people attempt to use tourism for their own ends, to either keep their community the same or work to change it. This process is highly fraught, and at times imagined futures are bitterly contested because they deal with key questions of power, identity, and the very future of the community itself. As for tourism, it's slowly returning as tourism entrepreneurs pivot to growing markets of pilgrims, business travelers, and other domestic tourists. This offers a pathway for tourism to remain relevant to these communities, but this transition is possible because of the infrastructure and knowledge base that trekking tourism through the Tamang Heritage Trail originally created. The tourism features and afterlives of Upper Rasu are still unfolding, and what happens over the next few years is a promising area of future study. Thank you.
Anna, do we take any questions now?
We'll take the questions at the
Together,
very
right?
end.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank
We
you.
sit here or up here?
You can sit
You can sit
wherever
here,
you
we
want.
can come at the end maybe then.
It'll be better if you can watch.
Okay, yeah, I think that's why it'll be easier for you to watch
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
They will do the Q&A again. All right.
Aqsa, can you find yours?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right on the desk.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Aqsa, and she'll introduce the paper.
good afternoon. I'm Aqsa Mengal, and the topic I'm presenting on, or the paper I'm presenting today is called Sardar or Sarkar, the Climate Justice Implications of Balochistan's Sovereignty Movement. This is just a quick table of contents to ground my discussion. So essentially, I'm going to start off with the introduction, but the main bulk of my talk will focus on the historical context of the sovereignty movement in Balochistan, how it's been shaped by the region's pre-colonial past, then colonial rule, post-partition governance, and then what the movement looks like today from the early 2000s until the present. And then I'll dive a little deeper into the demands and how all of that is tied to climate disasters and what the future of the region will look like, or could look like. So just a quick overview of the theoretical framework I used to ground my study. So this study conceptualizes the ongoing sovereignty movement in Balochistan, which, by the way, for those not familiar, is a province in Pakistan, as a corollary to the climate justice movement in the global south. By tracing the roots of the sovereignty movement and its current demands and manifestations, this research aims to highlight the interlinkages between historical colonial processes and contemporary structures of injustice in the province. This third point is a shift on linguistic choices that I very actively make. I call it the sovereignty movement because I want to shift away from a reductive state-sanctioned understanding of the movement, which often relegate it to a separatist insurgency or an armed conflict, which the Pakistani state loves to use. And this study draws on the writings of Olufemi Taiwo, Carmen Gonzalez, and Laura Pulido to problematize the role of the Pakistani state and situate it as a functionary of colonialism and racial capitalism. I argue that the reparational responsibility is therefore not of the Pakistani state alone, but a more systemic undertaking between the global north and its functionaries in the global south. And thus, what are some possible advocacy and policy avenues that the climate justice movement offers that address the underlying structural demands of Balochistan's sovereignty movement? So just a quick map to provide geographical context. Balochistan is the largest province in terms of land area of Pakistan. It's located in the south near the Arabian Sea, and this is where it's located within the broader geographical context of the region. So I'm going to start off by talking about the colonial rule and the historical context of Balochistan. And the first part focuses on pre-colonial Balochistan. The time period I'm focusing on is from the mid-17th to the mid-19th century here. So prior to the colonization of the subcontinent, Balochistan was governed under the Khanate of Kalat from 1666 until roughly 1838. The Khanate, which emerged from a confederacy of nomadic Brahwi tribes, was formed in the mid-17th century, primarily as a means for preventing invasions from the regional Mughal and Safavid empires. The Khan, who was essentially the ruler through the Khanate, his political legitimacy was substantiated through his relationship with the local tribal chiefs, known as Sardars, who were largely free to conduct their tribal affairs but pledged allegiance to the Khan. This structure often led to intertribal tensions between Sardars and between the Sardars and the Khan. Despite the establishment of the Khanate during this time period, the political structure was never fully a sovereign polity, and tribal leaders of the Khanate continued to swear loyalty and pay tributes to leaders of the regional empires at the time. So coming now to British colonial rule from roughly 1838 to 1947, British intervention into Balochistan is first traced to the mid-1830s with the British Empire's extension of its authority westward in the subcontinent. The reasoning provided for this by the British was protection of India and generally the subcontinent from external threats, which was essentially a preoccupation of the British with Russian power and control in neighboring Afghanistan. Also the fact that critical supply and trade roads to Kabul ran through Balochistan. Initially, the British did this by bolstering incentives and security forces to the Khan of Kalat. When that didn't work, the empire turned to a more forward policy of establishing control, which included the concentration of military force in tribal areas and patronage of tribal leaders. British colonial rule, as a result of what was happening during this time, they appropriated existing tribal hierarchies into its administration, which simultaneously preserved the tribal order of the local region, but on the other hand kept the tribal population isolated from broader civil society. By the time the partition of the subcontinent took place in 1947, the region had been divided between India, Iran, and Afghanistan, with the Khanate serving as a ceremonious protectorate of the British Empire, and the local chiefs armed with security forces, militias, and patronage for policing the local tribal population. This is just a map that shows the geographical spread of Pakistan's major ethno-linguist groups, and the Baloch, as you can see in this map here, are even today in the present day spread out over Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, and some other Central Asian countries. Moving now towards post-partition governance and the creation of the Pakistani state. So once Pakistan was formed in August 1947, the Khan of Balad initially did not want to cede into Pakistan, right? Over a period of 9 months, there was a lot of back and forth, and finally the princely state of Kalat was forcibly annexed into Pakistan. After that, in 1952, the remaining princely states united to form the Baloch States Union, and eventually in 1970, the province of Balochistan was officially formed. And in 1976, with the passage of the System of Sardari Abolition Act, the state of Pakistan abolished any sort of chieftaincy in Balochistan and essentially tried to do away with tribal rule in the region. So at this point, any further discussion on the roots of the region's sovereignty movement begs the question of the formation of Pakistan and the rhetoric of state-making utilized to do so. Of course, as many of you know, in a race to maintain power in the subcontinent, religious rhetoric and the infusion of socio-political fissures along religious lines were utilized by the withdrawing British. The two-nation theory postulated that South Asian Hindus and Muslims could not live harmoniously in the same state and provided the main ideological foundation for Pakistani state nationalism. Moreover, tribalism in Balochistan and Pakistan more broadly was conceived by the British and later by the Pakistani state as an outdated governance structure that symbolized a pre-modern relic of the past. It is interesting to note, however, that despite the attempts made to abolish the institution of chieftaincy in post-colonial Balochistan, tribal identities and subjects continue to be reproduced. I unfortunately don't have the time to talk about that in this paper. That's a whole other topic on its own, but happy to chat about that further. And so the annexation of the Khanate led to a series of conflicts in 1948, 1958, and 1962 between the Pakistani state and military and Baloch nationalists. The articulations of an ideological foundation of Baloch nationalism and resistance, inspired by Marxist-Leninist liberation movements, emerged shortly after the encounters of 1962, which stemmed from demands by Baloch nationalist leaders for an increased share of royalties that the Pakistani state was accruing from natural gas extraction in the district of Sui in Balochistan. The military dictator, General Zia-ul-Haq, I'm sure some of you are familiar with that name, his 10-year presidential term that started in 1978 is commonly understood as the Islamization era of Pakistan, with a particular focus on the provinces of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Zia aimed to centralize the state's power in the federal government through the use of Islamization. While there was no particular novelty to these policies that Zia was using, he ended up taking the Islamization strategy much further than his predecessors. He established an increasing number of madrasas, which are Islamic religious schools, which came at the cost of non-religious or secular schooling for the local population. Recognizing the ideological facade as an attempt by the military regime of Zia to fragment ethnic identities and centralize power, Baloch nationalists stood against and continue to stand against the Islamization process as a rejection of centralization, but not necessarily as a rejection of Islam as a religious tradition per se. And hence, with Zia's regime, the placement of radical religious proxies in Balochistan thus became an integral part of the military strategy in the province and continues to be utilized. So, moving on to sort of the last piece of the historical bit, which was essentially the Musharraf regime, started in 2000 and all the way to the present. This is the most recent period of Balochistan's sovereignty movement and is the longest and most violent period of the movement. It coincides with a number of political-economic developments that occurred in the early 2000s, one of the most salient being the military coup of General Pervez Musharraf in 1999, which is that guy right there on the left, and his subsequent term as president from 2001 to 2008. Musharraf's approach to centralization was far more violent and forceful than those of his predecessors. At the same time that Musharraf came into power, the Baloch sovereignty movement's calls for an increase in gas royalties coming from the Sui gas fields was growing. Tensions grew further when gold was discovered, and licenses for extraction of gold and copper in districts across Balochistan were issued to French, Australian, and Chinese firms. The construction of several infrastructure projects, army bases, military cantonments across the province deepened the local population's outcry, leading to loss of livelihoods for fishing communities and a drastic rise in land grabbing by the Pakistani military and foreign governments. The situation came to a boiling point in January 2005, which eventually led to an armed revolt against the state's forces, against Pakistani state's forces carried out by Bukti tribesmen and their chief Nawab Akbar Bukti, which is this person here on the right. Akbar Bukti's murder at the hands of the Musharraf regime was a watershed moment that radically changed the course of the sovereignty movement in Balochistan. Musharraf thus enacted what became known as the kill and dump and the missing persons policies, which have essentially morphed into a slow genocide of the local population. Prior to his dictatorship, sovereignty activists were arrested on formal charges and sentenced to fixed terms in prison that were known to their families. During Musharraf's era, mass kidnappings, arbitrary detentions, torture, disappearance of activists, and collective punishment inflicted on families of alleged dissenters became the norm, and these tactics have carried forward and continue to be the primary mode of operation of the Pakistani state and military in Balochistan today. So what essentially are the demands of the sovereignty movement? What are these folks asking for? So the demands of the sovereignty movement have been tied primarily to three overarching points. One, calls for equitable resource distribution. Two, increased shares in royalties accrued from resources appropriated from the region. And three, greater provincial autonomy within the political structure. The clearest articulation of these demands was provided by a 15-point plan shared by Akbar Bukti. A second attempt at codifying these demands was done through the Aghaaz-e-Huquq-e Balochistan package presented by the Zardari government. Unfortunately, the plan was never implemented, but I just wanted to highlight some of the quick points that came up as part of that sort of document. The first being the return of political exiles, the liberation of jailed Baloch political activists, the army's withdrawal from some key areas in the province, a reform of the federal resource allocation mechanism, efforts to create jobs, and greater provincial control of Balochistan's resources. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time, but essentially a lot of the issues are related to resources, particularly natural gas, and gas royalties, which are taken from Balochistan. The provincial government only gets 12.5% of those royalties, and that amount or that percentage was fixed in 1973 and has remained constant since then. The underlying forms of injustice that the movement foregrounds are thus one, distributive injustice, and two, procedural injustice. Human rights figure as a formative part of any conception of justice put forward by the movement, where the right to life, health, education, participation, and cultural integrity are central to a normative conception of the province's future. I unfortunately don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip this, but I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the 2022 floods that took place in Pakistan. Balochistan was one of the most heavily impacted provinces in the region. Other climate impacts, of course, include, amongst a range of others, extreme heat. A city in the south of Balochistan called Turbat is the 7th hottest place in the world. It is also a city with an extremely high military and police presence and some of the highest numbers of enforced disappearances of local activists and students. So what are some grassroots strategies that are being used for disaster rehabilitation in a region where the state isn't providing any support, right? So I just want to quickly highlight two grassroots organizations. One of them is called Madad Balochistan and the other is Baloch Youth Action Committee. They provide disaster aid rehabilitation following climate disasters, and the reason I want to highlight them is because they draw upon international climate justice discourse specifically to link their efforts to the broader sovereignty movement and the historical context of climate justice in Balochistan. So sort of just to conclude, this is my second last slide, Why climate justice, right? Why am I tying this movement to climate justice? So if we are to conceptualize climate injustice as a continuation and expression of historical processes of colonialism and racial capitalism, and their systemic manifestations within the economic structures of modern nations, the importance of a reparational approach to justice becomes pertinent for any solutions working towards achieving climate justice. In the case of Balochistan sovereignty movement and corresponding grassroots climate justice movement, activists partaking in these spaces foreground and call for a reparative framework towards resource allocation, political autonomy, infrastructural development, and foreign and domestic aid and budgetary allocations. Again, as noted, the responsibility is not of the Pakistani state alone, and these are just some examples of policy solutions that can or may address these concerns if done in an equitable manner. So this research traced the history of Balochistan sovereignty movement by situating it in the colonial context from which it emerged and the present-day post-colonial structures of the Pakistani state in which it continues to play out. The demands of the movement are dynamic and shifting as local communities, particularly the youth, reimagine their identities as tribal subjects. The movement is undergoing a shift in approach and vision as younger generations rework their understanding of their identities in a backdrop of tribalism greatly subsumed in colonial patronage. And sustained solutions, of course, need to be addressed through community-based solutions and policy making, which operate both at the hyper-local level but are tied to international climate justice discourse and on how reparations and accountability should be conceived locally and globally. I don't think we have time for questions right now, but I can answer them.
All right, so the final paper for the session is by Mangalika. So I think we should have enough time for Q&A.
Good.
So it's okay. All right.
Thank you. So the title of my presentation is Banjaxed Sovereignty, Reimagining the Needful, Non-Sovereign Democratization. I just want to give you the meaning of Banjaxed. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term. It refers to something ruined, battered, destroyed. In April 2022, Sri Lanka, notable for South Asia's most optimistic human and social development indicators, and classified by the World Bank as middle-income country, declared its first sovereign debt default of US $51 billion, resulting in extreme scarcity of foreign currency reserves for importing essential food, fuel, and medicine. Mass protests were precipitated by mile-long consumer queues where many suffered from and or died of heat stroke and dehydration while toting empty cooking gas canisters, 13-hour daily electricity blackouts, and the restriction of many working-class families to 1 meal per day.
Do you have slides? No.
No.
Okay, good.
As people were held captive to interminable queues, the once tolerated parapolitical patron-client networks of state kleptocracy were lambasted as saboteurs of the economy, the law, and governmental proceduralism. Protesters demanded the resignation of the Rajapaksa regime, including the entire parliament, for malfeasance and for transplanting the burden of odious debt to the multitude. Populist indignation bore witness to kleptocracy, national economic paralysis, and the collapse of public safety sector nets such as medical goods and services. These catastrophic forces fractured the post-war social contract premised on economic betterment, expanding life chances promised by the autocratic and dynastic Rajapaksa regime and the Buddhist supremacist state apparatus. An electoral landslide had brought the Rajapaksa dynasty back into power in the aftermath of Islamist Easter Sunday bombings of churches and tourist hotels in 2018 that many, like the Archbishop of Colombo, suspected had been engineered by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. The emergent Aragalaya or Janata Aragalaya, struggle or people struggle, magnetized streams of protesters from diverse ethnic, class, and cultural strata across the country. Aragalia bypassed hierarchically entrenched, majoritarian, minoritized hierarchies and challenged government by fiat and dissimulation. It grew out of spontaneously nightly vigils that live-streamed assemblies, which popularized derisive hashtags like Gota Go Home and Kaputu Kaf, the squawking crow. The latter disseminated the irresistible and overloaded analogy between the beast and the sovereign, an onto-zoanthropotheological political copulation that exists outside of law and above and below polity. Aragalia scandalized the political establishment and electrified mass support and mass media through parodic, profaning, and scatological imagery, signage, and sloganeering as they occupied the center of the capital, inaugurating a terra nullius and a democracy ex nihilo. In a candlelight vigil before the president's private home, the protesters wielded placards and chanted, "Go home, Gota, go home, Gota is a dictator." The protest chants and signage conferred upon the Rajapaksa dynasty a string of epithets: bloodsuckers, leechers, parasites, and executioners. Gota was dubbed the Terminator, and his underwear subjected to profane public display after the protesters invaded the presidential palace. Protests surged throughout the city, burning logs to block traffic, while women unprecedentedly took to the streets, clanging now useless pots and pans for which there was nothing to cook. A combined military police attack on Aragalia galvanized over 500 lawyers to the protest side to defend and legitimize the non-partisan Nirpakshika uprising. An island-wide state of emergency with a 36-hour curfew and social media blackout triggered mass anger. The site of protest soon centered upon Goldface Green, with a view to bringing those who looted the country to book. This mile-long oceanfront green space had hosted Sri Lanka's first independence celebrations in 1948. Aragalia erected a tent city, renaming the esplanade facing the presidential secretariat Gota Go Gama, Gota Go Home Village, protest village, complete with mobile toilets, health facilities, free food kitchens, libraries, a people's university, medical clinic, legal aid, international media center, the tear gas cinema, and petition signing kiosks publicizing silent state crimes, including state disavowed enforced disappearances of Tamils, artists, JVP insurgents, and journalists. Stages were erected for scholarly teachings, folk artists, popular bands, theater groups, and choirs singing "Do You Hear the People Sing" from Les Miserables. Teachings were convened by architects, engineers, political scientists, anthropologists, historians, journalists, development theorists, economists, bankers, human rights activists, and financial experts who brainstormed with people on corruption, wealth transfers, executive presidency, nepotism, authoritarianism, kleptocracy, brain drain, media censorship, and extravagant infrastructure projects financed by Chinese loans. Catholic priests, nuns, Hindu priests, Muslim imams, and Buddhist monks congregated on site as religious pluralism was considered to be constitutive of the country's cultural fabric. Catholic nuns held nighttime vigil to deter attacks from infiltrators, and Buddhist monks mounted hunger strikes until the occupation's demands were met. Vehicles tooted horns to the tune of Kaputu Kap Kap Kap, parodying the beastly sovereign. At Gota Go Gama and in neighborhood vigils, entire families demonstrated with children holding placards and chanting slogans. Reimagining the Needful. My ethnographic inquiry concerns Aragalia's reimagining of society by instituting a rupture between the political and politics, between potentia, constituting power, and potestas, constituted power, the latter as the procedural politics that defend, consolidate, and reproduce a dominant constituted reality. The temporality, spatiality, soundscapes, and iconography of Aragalia interrupted statist and static politics through public assemblies parodic derogation of the interlocking ideological and repressive foreclosures of Sri Lankan governmentality, Dushaniya, Bhishaniya, corruption and terror. This hegemonic oscillation between the sovereign and the beast has infected Sri Lankan governmentality since 1948, irrespective of the party in power. The occupation was a constituent assembly, disjunctive with ordinary politics, and offering the possibility of forms and practices of sovereign popular self-rule, in which democracy is presented as irreducible to constitutional politics in its opposition to kleptocratic dynastic depoliticization and fossilization as the originating constitutional fault line. Paradoxically, the rightist Carl Schmitt terms this a third moment in democracy as assuring the greatest possible participation of the citizens in public life that remediates the relations between the rulers and the ruled and between constituted order and political potentiality and natality. The constituent power of the people cannot be transmitted, alienated, absorbed, or consumed. It always continues to virtually exist, to coexist, and to remain superior to any constitution that proceeds from it. Citing Rousseau, Schmitt declares, the people cannot be represented. It cannot be represented because it must be present. Only an absent people can be represented and not a present people. This virtual autarky of the people intersects with Lefort's notion of savage democracy as the ordeal of the uncontrollable that allows the indetermination of the social sphere and its necessary inner opposition to freely unfold. The term savage does not infer primitivity, nor a Hobbesian state of nature. As Abansua defines it, Lefort's savage democracy evokes rather the idea of the wildcat strike, grève sauvage. In other words, a strike that arises spontaneously, one that begins with itself and unfolds in an anarchic fashion, independent of any principle or any authority, as well as of any established rules and institutions, and that strikes in such a way that it cannot be mastered. As a refusal to submit to the established order, as the dissolution of the bearings of certitude, savage democracy inaugurates a history in which people experience an ultimate indeterminacy as to the foundations of power, law, and knowledge, and to the foundations of the relations between self and other at every level of social life. Hegel's philosophy of right identifies a socially excluded, uncivil form or life termed the rabble, who literally embody socio-political, economic disorganization that decays into societal fractions severed from instituted socio-political totalization and objectification. Hegel calls the rabble the excremental exudation and the unbonded of civil society. He assigns to the rightless rabble the part with no part in the social order, an extrajudicial right of distress that interrupts the circulation of time, intrinsic to the holding of property and propriety. The extraordinary reoccupation of space and time by Aragale constitutes such an interruption in its indignation over debt distress. Its place lies beyond the space of normality. Its popular sovereignty corresponds to an extraordinary time and space. Since the framework of normality cannot be broken open from within, the state of exception must be declared by outsiders who interrupt the line of customary continuity. The rabble know without being permitted to know that constituted power in producing the rabble has exuded something that it cannot recognize as its own. In violating the continuity of institutional right, particularly the right to be without right, the rabble's right to distress appears as criminality, a convergence with which Palestinians in search of self-determination and those who cry Black Lives Matter are intimately familiar. The right of distress entails the distinction between a transgression, respectively based on distress or crime. Hegel divided criminality into that which is based on necessity and that which is not. A crime that falls under a right of distress is not exactly a crime. It is a transgressive non-crime and thus constitutes a sphere of cacophony amidst the discursive sonority of law and civility. Distress, as vocalized right, expresses the fact that the right of civil society to define itself as such unavoidably generates the incivility of deprivation and wretchedness. Civil society as a social order based on rights has to recognize an unknown and transgressive surplus distress that originates in its own socio-economic reproduction in time and space. The contradictions of civil society, civil statist society, is crystallized by the corporeal performance of distress that expresses an existential surplus of the civil order that is alien to it. Rancière and Agamben identify the binary of logos, a lawful speech, versus phone, the naked or bare voice of distress, as not only concerning communicative capacities, but as indicative of the political distribution of vociferous bodies across politicized zones of sensibility and insensibility, and the visible and invisible. The logos phone disjuncture implicitly speaks to the subjectifying passage of political actors from pain and injury to resonating vociferous affect arrayed against the deja vu, the already said. The right to distress founds the difference between an unintelligible acoustics of injury as phone and the vociferated claiming of entitlement and ethicality, logos, as the threshold between politically admissible and inadmissible speech. To conclude, the advent of the commissariat, lasting between the period March-August 22, the occupation forced the resignation of the entire Rajapaksa nepotistic cabinet. On July 2nd, Rajapaksa fled the country. A protester tweeted, "Once the most feared man in the country was rendered a joke. Now having to hide from his own voters, fleeing in the dead of night." Prior to absconding, he had appointed Wickramasinghe, a new liberal from a party of which he was the only unelected parliamentary representative, to be prime minister, and who was subsequently unconstitutionally elected as president by a now rogue parliament to politically salvage Rajapaksa's futures and fortunes. Wickramasinghe's private residence, replete with rare books and antiquities, was set on fire under mysterious circumstances on the same day that Rajapaksa escaped the country. The president-elect launched a nighttime military assault on Gotago Gama. He condemned the occupiers as uncivilized, violent drug addicts, extremists and terrorists with allegiances to anti-democratic parties. The new president's regime took the form of Schmidt's dictatorial commissariat, appointed by a high political authority to eliminate enemies during a crisis that threatens the present regime. In these emergencies, the high authority appoints the commissarial dictator to suspend the existing legal order, to remove threat, and to restore the previous normative formation, as the president-elect did with his new Prevention of Terrorism Act, targeting the occupation and its options. The commissariat has unrestrained power, and no moral or legal limits constrain his actions. The commissariat operates outside the law in a normless vacuum. The singularity of this type of dictatorship, according to Schmidt, is found in the fact that all is justified that appears to be necessary for a concretely gained success, that is, a return to the status quo ante bellum. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent paper. May I request the presenters maybe to come here, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Questions?
Two questions. How do you see, so the Chinese are building a port at Gavadir and Balochistan is the key site of CPEC. So, and now there is a Cold War between, I mean, there has been for a while, China and the United States, and so Balochistan is at the epicenter of that Cold War. So how do you see that changing the situation? Do you think the dynamics of, not the climate specifically, but the movement for justice and rights, like how do you see that changing? And the question about Sri Lanka is like, what is the state of that movement now? It was violently dispersed, but where is it now?
If there are similar questions, maybe we can club them together so that maybe. Yes.
My question is for Aqsa. Thank you. That was really.
May I also request you to just introduce yourselves just for the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Pallavi Gupta. Thank you for all the 3 presentations. It was really wonderful. My question is for Aqsa. Thank you for historicizing it so beautifully. So you talk about racial capitalism in your abstract, and I was thinking if you could expand it a little bit in terms of how you apply it and how the framework fits in. Thank you.
My question is also for Aqsa. Oh, sorry, I'm Nepal Kurgan. And my question is 2 questions about Balochi nationalism and identity. I'm more familiar with the Indian context and how there's special constitutional protections for tribal areas. I was wondering if there's anything similar in the Pakistani context and how these struggles are maybe working within the constitutional or legal frameworks to demand rights or rather than, like a complete overthrow of the state. And the second is, do you see a mapping of the pre-colonial, the elites, the Khans, in terms of who is benefiting maybe from the gas and this infrastructure, and if there's a collusion between those elites and the state that is making things a little harder for the struggle to succeed?
I think we will do it with those questions.
Well, can I, mine is sort of to the activism issue, so I'd like to just bring that up. Because that's just the one thing. I have some other questions for the other panelists, but I just want to piggyback on that idea, and I'd like a little bit more information about how activism manifests itself in these environments, because I couldn't get a sense of that, and what kind of protest movements have occurred and been effective or ineffective. So if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that, I'm interested in that.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your really wonderful questions. I unfortunately had a lot more to say, but of course, in the interest of time, I couldn't. To start off with your question, so CPEC is actually worsening the situation. While we're hearing more, CPEC is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It was actually the latest period that I talked about, starting with the 2000s. That's when the treaty began, the conversations started between the Pakistani state and the Chinese government. And that actually fueled the current situation, right? CPEC it undergirds a lot of the issues that the local population has with the state, and it plays a very strong role in the forms of activism that are currently playing out. So I don't want to be a pessimist, but that is actually the reason why things are so bad right now. This CPEC is one of the primary things, and a lot of that has to do with land appropriation, loss of livelihoods for fishing communities, lack of energy access for local communities in the south of Balochistan, particularly in Gavadir, Turbat, and the rest of the coastal highway. So that is what I would say on that piece, that it will all depend on both the Chinese government and the Pakistani government's response to the local population's demands, but so far it's only been negative. It hasn't been something like, okay, let's come to the table and have a conversation. It's more so, we're gonna put more weight on you and more military pressure to worsen the situation rather than help it. So.
I don't think they see them as human.
No, they don't.
The military does not see them as, they say it's very few people. And,
yeah. Should I answer?
Yeah, you can,
okay.
Maybe, and then we can come to Mangalika.
Yeah. So your question about racial capitalism actually ties in together with that one really well. The way I use that is through the works of Laura Pulido, not directly the original source of racial capitalism, but the way she interprets it. And that's essentially how is the devaluation of non-white bodies built into the post-colonial context of Pakistan, right? How is Pakistan, again, it's a very different ethnic context, but how are the ethnic identities of Balochistan's sort of population seen as communities where both the environment, the resources are devalued in the same way that the humans are, right? So how is the Pakistani state's capitalist project tied to the oppression of the folks of this region? And that's sort of the racial capitalist lens that I was tying together with the context of reparations and how it, again, this all started with the British, right? The Pakistani government is just following the same roadmap and it's intensifying it, but the entire process started with the British wanting to come in, establish more control, appropriate resources, trade routes, and then now the Pakistani government is carrying that forward. So, sorry, if I confuse your questions, like if I mess them up, please correct me. So the first one that you asked was about how
constitutional protections for
tribalism. Yeah. So my knowledge might be limited on this, but there were certain parts of Pakistan that were, so FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, did have tribal protections. Over the past few years, though, even that region has been subsumed under Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In Balochistan, there are no tribal protections. The abolition of the Sardari Act that I was talking about in the 1970s, tribalism was no longer allowed. And even now in any part of Balochistan, you're not allowed to self-govern through constitutionally protected tribal rights. But that was my point, that you cannot outlaw tribalism because it's not just a political governance structure, right? I'm a member of a tribal community there, and a lot of our livelihoods are still shaped by tribal structures. Our conflict resolution, our, like things like marriages or celebrations or any sort of traditions are still very tied to the local tribal historical and cultural context. So while legally there are no protections, but social-culturally, tribalism is still a part of the social-cultural fabric of the region, I would say. And then the second question, sorry.
It was just about the elites. Like, is there the pre-colonial, like the Khans and the Sardars? Like, are they the ones who are still benefiting from the gas? Is there some kind of collusion between them and the Pakistani state?
Yeah. So that was the part of the reason why I traced that historical context is because yes and no. I think yes in terms of the fact that there were a lot of historical ties between the British arming, both like in terms of weapons, but also in terms of capital, the Sardars. And that was a way of making them police their local tribal populations, right? You give the ruler weapons and money to police his populations, he will do that. And that has sort of still carried forward with the Pakistani state, but not nearly to the same extent that the Pakistani state portrays in popular media. It's a very easy tactic for the state to pin all of the ills of the region onto the Sardars and say, oh, the Sardars are the reason why everything is so bad for you. So yes and no. The Bukti tribe that I talked about, that was the region where most of the natural gas in Balochistan is found. That is also one of the most underdeveloped regions in Balochistan, right? And Bukti was by no means a supporter of the state. That's why he was killed by Musharraf. So the answer is it depends. It depends on the Sardar, it depends on the tribe, but it is definitely not black and white and not nearly in the ways that the Pakistani state would like for it to be.
So I think Mangalika answered the question that she had, because do you want to go on a little longer, or?
If we can do a quick transition to the next panel, sure.
Yes, so maybe it's...
the thing is, just for time, we need to get back on track for Suraj.
Yeah. So the next panel starts at about 2 o'clock, so we still have about 9 minutes by my
We have a
clock.
bathroom break.
Yes.
So maybe we can do another about 5 or 6 minutes.
Let's have Mangalika answer her question.
Yes, and then maybe
then we can break and keep talking.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, actually. So the crackdown of the protesters and the village really took place under the Reimagining regime. And this was a moment when particularly the international community and India wanted to see some kind of stability in Sri Lanka, right? And they did not want the protest to continue. And also the regime was afraid of the next phase, what comes after the crackdown, and what the protesters would do. And so over 3,000 people were jailed, and some had detention orders under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and some were tried and convicted. And so it was brutal and severe, and this actually deterred many, different groups, unions, social organizations, grassroots organizations that were part of that broad alliance mobilization. They withdrew support, so it could be sustained. And in a sense, this was a real defeat actually to the people's struggle. Yeah.
So we can take more questions, but maybe we can start rearranging the spatial arrangement here so that you guys can maybe anyone